Hello, good afternoon again, listeners. So I'm back with Warren Whatley and Gregory Price, and Warren was telling us a little about the Benin Empire. You can continue, Warren.
Yeah, I was referring to Benin as an example of an African coastal empire that consciously decided not to participate in the slave trade.
Yes, you're right.
Although it did have a history of trading slaves down the coast to the Akan in the 16th and 17th century. In fact, we know this very well because when the Portuguese arrived, they intercepted this trade. But that was a very small trade where Benin was expanding its commercial empire and conquering some of the entities around it. And were trading the captives down the coast to the Akan in exchange for gold and what have you that was coming out of the Gold Coast. So this was like a Mediterranean empire, where commercial exchange over long distances was happening, and that the expansion, the political expansion of Benin produced some captives. The important point here is that Benin did not then employ those captives internally. So it didn't develop a culture that where the laws and the norms and the mores and all had to accept slavery and justify slavery. Okay, so it's pretty liberal. It's pretty liberal. It's not until the Portuguese then start buying slaves from that bite that that Benin is sort of forced to sell to the Europeans what the Europeans wanted, which was slaves. Tried not to, long time didn't do it, but because it didn't, it weakened the economy and the state to the point where, subsequent writers say Benin was desolate, underdeveloped, abandoned even by the late 18th century.
The Benin Empire is really a fascinating case because had it not been for some internal challenges or and political miscalculations, maybe the British would have failed in their attempt to colonize Benin. It was until 1897 that the British really developed a strong foothold in Benin. Many of the European writers who went to Benin actually admired the empire. And Benin transitioned quite earlier and easier to legitimate trade when compared to other places in Africa. Just recently, I had a professor, an academic, he's in a PhD, and he was telling us about the foreign policy of Benin.
Right, correct. Benin's a fascinating case. Another fascinating case is Zimbabwe. Also embedded in the what they call the medieval global economy because it was exporting gold. But the interesting thing about Zimbabwe is that Zimbabwe built these huge stone structures. They had towns, that surrounded Great Zimbabwe. Long history of exporting gold and manufacturings and a whole host of things. But there's no evidence that Zimbabwe used slaves to do this.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if we have an answer to that yet.
Well, I am laughing because apparently, well, I'm 28, but long before my time, there was a popular view in some circles that structures in Great Zimbabwe were not built by Africans, but by Jewish outsiders. Yes.
Right.
Or even
we know that's not true.
Ancient aliens, extraterrestrials.
Yes, yeah, ancient aliens. Well, that's actually taken seriously by a lot of people.
Yeah, right, but that's not true. That's not true.
Ancient aliens, but I don't know
when confronted with a strong critique of your priors, you're bound to reach any answer you can muster.
But back to Great Zimbabwe, just last week I had Ezekiel Metwa. We were talking about iron production in Great Zimbabwe. So not every now and then, but more frequently, I have been interviewing African scholars to talk about life in pre-colonial Africa. And many of them are mainland African scholars. They were born in Africa, even if they live in Europe or America today.
Right.
So really interesting stuff. Like both of you are also interested in political history. The Oyo Empire, many call the Oyo Empire a constitutional monarchy. So if it was a constitutional, well, it's actually, well, in African academic history, there's a new consensus that pre-colonial Africa was not a den of autocracies. And in Oyo Empire, it was actually easier to dethrone the Alafin. Many Alafin would actually commit suicide if people no longer saw them as useful. They were an Oyo, Messi, and Bashorum, and they could force the Alafin of Oyo to commit suicide. So some are arguing that African monarchies had even greater constraints on the executive.
Right, that they weren't absolutist monarchies, right? David Graeber and Marshall Solins have just written a book on kingship where they analyze a lot of this, and they think Africa is the example par excellence. But we know that the Normans invaded England, and that's the beginning of the whole sort of doomsday survey and the Magna Carta and all that in England. But yeah, the king comes in, represents an external ancestry, does not control the land, but leaves the land in the hands of the indigenous people. Thus you get this original stratification in kingship societies. And they argue that this is universal. This is how it's created. So the people always have some kind of veto power on the king, especially if you're a weak king, like the Norman king that conquered England in the 12th century, but also in Africa. There's the origin stories of many of these empires has to do with an external force conquering a set of people. Mali is that way, Ghana was that way. All of the Muslim Sahelian empires were that way. Always identified Islam in the Middle East as the source of the state, but not the people. So the state would be Muslim, but the people would still have their own indigenous theories and ideology.
Before I talk to Gregory, quick point about the Benin Empire. So to prevent confusion, yes, Benin was not an active participant in the slave trade for as long as other places in Africa, but there was indigenous slavery in Benin. Now, Gregory, what is your major area of research? I'm more familiar with the work of Professor Warren Whatley.
Oh, so I mean, broadly, I'm an applied theorist and applied econometrician. So, so that pretty much I cast a pretty wide net: stratification and the intergenerational effects of slavery. Yeah. So.
Okay, so tell us about your paper on the intergenerational effects of slavery.
Okay, well, in fact, I emailed that to you. So in that paper, of course, the idea was that when you look at, one of the things we observe in societies is that there's a correlation between the status of parents and offsprings, right? That correlation is non-zero. In other words, if my father was a ditch digger, that increases the probability that I'm going to be a ditch digger, right? And that's just a long-term correlation. So in that case, that suggests, of course, that that the sins of the fathers are visited upon the sons. As Gary Clark would say, that the son always rises. So I looked at these long-run intergenerational correlations between having a father born in slavery and your status up to the 1930s. And the census data, we have some manuscript census data allows us to look at that there. And you can only track males because females change their name upon marriage. They lose their original surname. So I look at Black males up until 1930 who had a father born in slavery, right? That had the effect of lowering their socioeconomic status relative to Blacks who did not have a father born in slavery, which suggests that the legacy of slavery transmits across the generation, given the correlation between the status of offspring and parents. And that correlation has been found in a wide variety of studies.
Yes.
But I found a case of where Black males who were the offspring of slave descendants, that they suffered a penalty by moving down the socioeconomic distribution, right? And I say that broadly because that we have a measure in that census data. They come up with a blunt measure of socioeconomic status. So slavery has effects. Then I estimated. The interesting is I estimated. Well, let's assume there's a constant radioactive decay rate of the effects. How long would it take for the effects of slavery to wear out? Because I had to stop in 1930. Making some assumptions, the effects will wear out in 2083, right? 2083, right? And that's a ceteris paribus assumption. It would take another. So here we are in 2023. It would take another 60 years, all things being equal, for the intergenerational effects of slavery to peter out, if you will.
Well, Gregory, I must say that family status has an enduring effect on current status. So both of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Gregory Clark. I interviewed Gregory Clark some time ago.
The son also rises.
Yes, and Gregory Clark is of the view that social mobility, well, at least relative social mobility, doesn't really exist. So we inherit cultural and human capital from our ancestors. So if my grandfather was, let's say, a tailor, and I become a doctor, that's social mobility. But let's say, for example, that my grandfather was a tailor. His grandfather owned 200 acres over due to bad business practices. He became a pauper. When I become a doctor, my family is actually reverting to the norm. So over time, the same families tend to occupy the more important roles in society. So even if we encounter relative mobility in one generation because of the cultural and human capital of that particular family, provided that the descendants improve themselves or aim to improve themselves, then we will revert to the norm. So social mobility in that context doesn't really exist.
Well, yeah, and the other thing is we don't know why. If societies were truly egalitarian, there would be no correlation between offspring and parent status. That's what a true egalitarian society looks like. But in the real world, there is a positive correlation. The question is, why is that? What is the exact mechanism by which status is transmitted from parents to offspring? Is it networks? Is it comparative advantages? Either way, you get a very unfair, inegalitarian society. So I always rib my egalitarian friends here. We talk about we need to increase wealth and access. I'm saying, but for whom? Because all we end up doing is replicating the overall inequality we already see. In other words, if certain Black parents have advantages and some don't, you'll still see this status inequality that persists, right? It doesn't get you a fair society. In a fair society, the correlation between parents and offspring will be zero. And that's an extreme case, extremely fair society.
Yes, and when we talk about human capital and social status, I am not afraid to engage the research. And I'm sure you have in your spare time. I've read many of those studies and I've interviewed even some of these academics who have, how should I put this? Who have been cast aside by polite society, but I have no problem engaging the rigors of IQ research. So I like to have the defenders of the genetic component of IQ on the show and the cultural advocates. And for some people, social mobility doesn't exist because of IQ. This question is for both Warren and Gregory. What are your thoughts on the genetics of IQ? If you have been studying the issue, that's a big topic in the States, always a topic.
Yeah, it's a hot button issue because historically the stereotype has been that Blacks, slavery justified for the justification for slavery was that Blacks were subhuman and didn't possess the requisite mental attributes of humans. So it's a third rail. To what extent is the ability to engage in cognitive tasks heritable? It may or may, it probably is, but the question of what consequence is that? What consequence? I mean, genes interact with the environment, they express themselves differently. They're not fixed. I mean, my view is that genetic traits aren't fixed. They just don't emerge in a vacuum. Okay? They don't emerge.
Warren, what do you think about IQ?
I don't know. Not necessarily a mechanism I've ever explored closely. The recent popularity of what is his name?
Charles
Weird.
Mar-
Henry.
Oh, yeah, I interviewed Joe. Yeah, Joe was on the show. Yeah.
Good for you. Well, I would imagine he would say something like, the Protestant Reformation and the expansion of reading in the common population of Europe influenced the IQ, their ability to read, and the whole culture, a whole bunch of things. But I would imagine one of them, would be IQ. So, I mean, going back to what Greg just said, IQ is in a sense endogenous, a product of what the society is doing and the opportunities that individuals have to do X, Y, or Z.
It's a function of diet. It's a function of diet. I'm sort of engaged in research now on the role of macronutrients on cognition. I mean, if between, and the hypothesis, if between the ages of 0 and 5, of course, you're deficient in macronutrients, you're eating a lot of fried food, fast food, and not a lot of fruits and vegetables, that can affect brain development.
Yes.
So when you think about the distribution of diets in the West, for example, I mean, I grew up in an urban area. I mean, we didn't have a lot of fresh food, but how did that affect my cognitive development? Because I didn't eat broccoli with high frequency and corn and greens. It could have an effect. It could have an effect, for example. So IQs are sensitive, are likely sensitive to diets between the ages of 0 and 5, rich in macronutrients. Right?
Yeah, nutrition and better schooling improve IQ score. There's this scholar who has done a lot of work on the psychosocial development of societies. He's not that popular, but he argues that development is a consequence of IQ and the gains are more cultural than genetic. So societies that are under selection pressure or greater selection pressure will do better in the long term. And even today, there are still places in large parts of the world where people, adults essentially, are still on the level of children. So he's a big fan of cross-cultural psychological research.
Yeah. But let me get an example. I mean, suppose, for example, vitamin K is a vital macronutrient for brain development. Now, if you're deficient in vitamin K, for example, I mean, your attention span is going to be very, very short. So if you're staring at the ability to negotiate a first order condition in calculus requires attention. It really does. But a vitamin K deficiency can likely disrupt the brain's executive control capabilities. Now, by the way, there's some stuff I'm trying to do. What makes a young man get up one day, or any person, and go on a mass shooting spree? Because somebody steps on his or her foot. That's the lack of executive control, right? I mean, that's a lack. What explains that? Could it be macronutrient deficiencies between the ages of 0 and 5? Just an hypothesis, right? So executive control, how you negotiate conflict, how you resolve disputes, to whether you can stare down mathematical proof. Both require executive control that could be sensitive to the amount of macronutrients one consumed during the early formative years. That's hypothesis.
Warren, what are you working on currently? What are you currently working on?
I am currently working on a paper with Greg. We were just working on that last night and this morning. That looks at the effects of the slave trade on population growth and GDP in Africa. So, and we're finding that the Atlantic slave trade had a pretty significant effect. We're thinking now somewhere between 15 and 20% decline in the rate of growth of population. Now you hook that into the new growth theories, where population growth influences the probability of technological change and things of that nature. Then this would translate into GDP growth as well. And we're still working on getting those numbers right, but that's where we're going with that. I'm also writing a book on Africa, the effects of the slave trade on Africa, and why Africa and Europe look like mirror images of each other. You can go down a whole list of institutions and norms, and you will see that much of Africa looks almost the opposite of Europe. Polygyny, monogamy,
Great.
democracy, aristocracy, a whole bunch of things. And I'm arguing that the slave trade explains this, that this sort of knife edge between freedom, the fact that Europeans identified themselves as, what's the best way to put it, as a league, so that where the teams could fight against each other, but they wouldn't enslave each other. But they could fight other people and enslave them. That Europe was able to fight wars without enslaving their own, whereas in Africa, that never, ever happened. Goes a long way towards explaining this knife edge. Why Europe developed one way, but was able to fight all these wars, and why Africa developed a different way because it was employing its captives, and a lot of that because the international slave trade made that a profitable thing to do. It was a form of wealth that states could organize around.
Warren, I'm happy that you're doing a paper on the slave trade and population growth in Africa, because the current literature on the effects of the slave trade on population in Africa appears to be a bit inconclusive. You should know more about the topic than maybe me and Greg. Maybe you do. You have published several papers on the slave trade. Did it really lead to depopulation based on pre-existing research, not what you're doing now? What's the real consensus?
There is no current consensus. I think our results suggest that, yeah, the slave trade reduced the rate of growth of population by about 20%.
And
I'm willing to say that.
Okay, and your paper could become a definitive text or article. I think so, because the evidence is really inconclusive. Some people argue that it led to severe depopulation, and others like David Eltis and David Richardson, they share a different view.
Yeah, Manning thinks that Patrick Manning thinks that depopulated in certain regions. I think it'd be hard pressed to reject that, in the case of Nigeria, the Biafra, for example. Just too many people came out.
Well, what's the counterfactual though? Nigeria could have been maybe been larger if they hadn't exposed to slavery, right?
No,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Bight of Biafra, I'm interested in the Bight of Biafra because many of the Igbos came from the Bight of Biafra. And they also went to Jamaica, and I love Nollywood movies, and Nollywood movies usually reflect Igbo culture. Because we're on the topic of economics and Africa's development, Igbo entrepreneurship, I've been talking to some academics about Igbo entrepreneurship. They seem to be quite successful inside and outside of Africa. Are either of you interested in the Igbos?
Yeah, I know they call them the Jews of Nigeria, right? The Jews of Africa. Yeah. But so no, I mean, the problem with Africa doing that type of research, getting high quality social science data, Nigerian census data would identify tribe. It's just hard getting that data. I mean, you can get household level data, but it doesn't report. I'm unaware, it doesn't report the rest of this with the Yoruba, Hausa, Igbo, et cetera. And that seems to be a unique United States and Canada type thing, even in Europe, capturing data at detailed levels of race and ethnicity. In Africa, hard to do. It's hard to do, right? Although the Afrobarometer allows you, they do language. They do language.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
and you know, and that's the importance of any effort to understand pre-colonial Africa, because the West begins to observe Africa during the colonial era, 19th century, mid-19th century on. Okay, there are very few European direct observations on Africa before then, you know, just very few. Yet scholars will always point to Africa as an example of what came before Europe, or what's different from Europe, or what have you. Now, the reason they're able to do that is because there's very little evidence on Africa prior to the 1850s or so. People really don't know, which is why I'm writing this book. I think I've developed a way to tease out more information about what's going on in Africa between 1500 and 1850. And it has to do with the new GIS technology and some data that's become available on transport costs and exposure to international slave trades. That's what that article on the effects of the international slave trades on Africa exploits, that kind of data, where you can talk about, oh, is the spatial distribution of institutions and norms and empires that the Europeans observed in the late 19th, early 20th century. Is the spatial distribution of that explained in any way by its proximity to slave ports? Okay, so you can tease out, and the slave ports are historical data. So you can tease out the effects of history on what we observe, you know, in the late 19th, early 20th century, what Du Bois called the color line.
So, Warren, in that book, will it be highly mathematical? So will are you going to put the calculations in your book? So if I'm reading a paper, I don't have a problem with the calculations, but for a book, I don't think that's why. So will your book have calculations and numbers and graphs?
Yeah. You know, on that note, I would love to have a dialogue with some physical anthropologists to look at the physical anthropological evidence about human remains and estimating their nutritional status across millennia. So we can get an estimate of what, you know, the rise and fall of material living standards based upon reasonable samples of human remains across, I don't know, a 20,000 year period, if that's possible. A lot of that work is taking place, you know, in other areas, right? Just inferring human living standards and social organization from just what we can infer from bones, human bones, you know, like what is David Steckel, dead men tell no lies, tell no tales, for example.
Well,
So,
we do have some data on the topic, and I do know that this trio, that they are interested in the physiological origin of the wealth of nations. Are you familiar with that paper? So they tend to look at nutrition, and it's linked to the it's
Sorry,
linked.
what paper is that?
The
What paper is that?
physiological origins of the wealth of nations. It's a paper by European economists. They like to study nutrition and the role of physiology in economic growth.
no.
Yeah, those are fascinating kinds of studies. You know, pretty much show that, you know, the transition to agriculture wasn't the be all we thought it would be. That the original innovators suffered greatly, you know, from disease and skeletal remains and heights of skeletons.
And heights, yeah, the height data is
Yeah,
sort of
so
inconclusive.
There is one interesting study, Greg, you might want to look at then, and ironically, it's an article by David Eltis.
Oh, David
where
Eltis, okay.
He looks at the heights of Yoruba slaves exported out of Nigeria in I believe the mid 19th century. And what he finds is that when the slave trade took off there, the heights collapsed. Okay.
Is this a new paper?
No, this paper is at least a decade old.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so he does have height data. The transatlantic database does have height data. It does have height data. Some height.
He got the height data from one of those data sets. I believe it's the names database.
Yeah, the names.
Yeah, so these are the ones who were repatriated. They were freed and repatriated.
So what's the story there? Heights decline with Yoruba heights decline. So implying that net nutrition
coming out, the slaves coming out of Europe over time as the slave trade took off, the heights of those Europeans, when matched up to their birth cohorts, right? That those birth cohorts experience a decline if you were born during the period of time that the slave.
So net nutrition went down. Net nutrition, that's net nutrition.
And this is for the Yoruba people, right?
Yeah.
Right, correct.
Oh, for the Yoruba.
So why would net nutrition go down? Why would slave trade?
Just the whole
I'm thinking out
collapse
loud.
of society, the whole collapse of order and agriculture and warring and what have you.
Yeah. So that's a measure of living standards decline with the opening of the trade slave.
Right.
Slave trade. Okay. Wow.
But Warren, you're yet to answer my question. Will your book be highly mathematical?
Oh, I hope not. If it has any math, it'll be in an appendix.
Okay, great. That's how it should be when you're writing a book. For a paper, you can have all the mathematics you want, but when you're writing a book, it should be in the appendix. So I'm wrapping up, and last question. Either of you can either answer or choose not to answer. So I tend to focus on economic and philosophical political research. I'm not a big fan of popular culture, what they call identity politics, but you can't get away from diversity. What do you think about Blacks in economics? Are Blacks underrepresented? We are two leading Black academics. Tell me about Blacks in economics. People are always talking about that issue.
You said Black economists?
Yeah, Black people in economics. That's a topical issue today. What
you have the man right there in Great.
Yeah, we're vulgarly underrepresented. I was born before the Civil Rights Act. I am now in Louisiana. In 1960, Louisiana had no Black. LSU had no Black economists. They've never had one now. Nor has Mississippi. Nor has Tennessee. Nor has University of Georgia. Nor has University of Kentucky. So we have this persistent vulgar status quo over 6 decades where there's been no Black economists on faculties at public flagship universities. So to me, that's an indicator. Now, of course, I'm not arguing that democracy ought to have true demographic parity, but when it's zero, I smell a rat. I smell a rat.
All right.
When it's zero, I smell a rat. Okay. And that's not good. That's not good. I mean, it's just not good. I mean, all Americans should have equal opportunity to participate in all the venues of American life, whether it be from A to Z, anthropology to zoology.
Well, as I said before, I'm not fond of the diversity mantra, but I think it's not good for representational issues. No, I don't have a problem with LeBron James doing sports and becoming a billionaire, but not all or most of the influential Black people can be sports people or entertainers. So for me, that's the true problem, the representation of Black professionals and how Black young people view themselves. Not all of them are going to be LeBron James.
No, there's only 450 jobs in the NBA. There's only 450 jobs.
Yes, we
The
want
labor
more,
force is 160 million plus.
Yeah, we want more quantitative economists like yourself and Warren.
Yeah, we need more anthropologists. We need more archaeologists. We need, Black folks need to participate in the full venue of human endeavors. I mean, it's not a good idea to be left out of any of these areas, right? That's what makes life worth living. Right?
All right, so thanks for showing up. I do believe that our conversation was awesome, and we're going to speak again. I'm planning to speak to Warren sometime next week to talk about his paper on the slave trades.
Okay, Lipton. Well, it's been a pleasure. I'll send me your website. I'll go to your website, and I think I found it incidentally, but I'll send me your webpage link, and I'll try to indulge myself with the overall body of work. Okay?
All right, thanks. Bye, Gregory and Warren.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.